Welcome everyone to another lecture in embryology, which is about development of foregut. Before start talking about the development of foregut, let me remind you what has been explained in the previous lecture. I think if you watched that lecture, you would see that the trilaminar embryonic disc start to differentiate, and three layers you have: ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm. And I think you remember that the lateral plate of mesoderm divided into parietal mesoderm and visceral mesoderm. And the visceral mesoderm, you see here, covers the endoderm and start to shrink with development, with the further development. Then this yolk sac shrinked, and ultimately the visceral mesoderm now covers the gut tube. That means we have a gut tube. And simultaneously, you remember that we said that the ectoderm form the neural tube, as you see, and the ectoderm overlaid by parietal mesoderm, then start to move ventrally, as you see here, until they meet and form the embryonic body cavity. Now back again to because we are in GI system, so we are concerned with the gut tube. This is the gut tube, and most of epithelium and the gland inside the gut tube derived from the endoderm, while the muscles, connective tissue, and other layers of GI tract are derived from the splanchnic mesoderm, or we call it visceral mesoderm, that we explained. Do you remember the visceral mesoderm, this one, the red one? So now it gives the muscles and connective tissue, not just encircle the endoderm, but also gives the muscle and connective tissue. So you know that the nervous system in the embryo grows very fast. That leads to or enhances the folding, axial folding of the embryo. And of course, the development of primitive gut tube that we explained extend, of course, along with the you see the ectoderm, and back again to the gut tube. You will see that it extends from the oral membrane or oropharyngeal membrane. That means the GI system in our body, even in adult, it extended from the mouth to the opening of the anus inferiorly. So it started from the oropharyngeal membrane here until the cloacal membrane. And we can divide it into three parts: the foregut, midgut, and hindgut. So what's important to know about each one, that what each part of the gut tube will form. It will develop for what? So it gives what? For example, let us start with the superior part, which is the foregut, and maybe the foregut extends from the pharynx all the way until it reaches the second part of duodenum. That means you can memorize it like this. So the foregut started from the pharynx, then after pharynx, we have esophagus, then it gives the stomach, then after stomach you have the duodenum. So, but not all the duodenum, just the first and the second part, right? Because the duodenum, 4 parts, just the second part of duodenum. So these structures originated from the, or developed from the, or represent the foregut, right? So from pharynx to the second part of duodenum. Now, what about the midgut that you see here still extended with the yolk sac? So it extends from the second part of the duodenum, and of course small intestine, jejunum and ileum, then large in now start the large intestine, ascending colon, transverse colon, but not all the transverse colon. Transverse colon can be divided into right 2/3 and left 1/3. So the midgut extends up to the right 2/3 until this point. That means it includes the right 2/3, right, of the transverse colon. Now, what about the hindgut? The hindgut extends from the left 1/3 of transverse colon to the end, right? I mean, descending colon, sigmoid colon, and rectum all the way until you reach the anus, right? So this is the hindgut, the remaining part of large intestine. So what's the significance of that? If you know the derivatives of foregut, midgut, and hindgut, well, you have, because now you know what each part will give, and you have to know that the blood supply for foregut is different than midgut, different than hindgut. For example, which is here very important also, so each part of the developing gut receives a branch from aorta. This is the aorta in the embryo. So, for example, the foregut, as you see here, it takes its blood supply from the celiac trunk. So this is the first branch of aorta. Okay, celiac trunk. Then the midgut, it takes its blood supply from the superior mesenteric artery, while the hindgut takes a blood supply from the inferior mesenteric artery, right? So you have celiac artery, superior mesenteric artery, and inferior mesenteric artery. Now, because you know this is again let us start with the foregut, right? This is the foregut you see until you reach the stomach, liver, and second part of duodenum. And because of the development of the respiratory diverticulum that will give the bronchi and lungs, it divides from, of course, if this is, look at the foregut, so it comes out from the floor of the foregut, right, and it divides the foregut into two parts, one part proximal, or one part rostral to it, and one part caudal to it. So the part that cranial to it, which is that known as primitive pharynx, and the part that's caudal to it, it's called foregut proper. Foregut proper. That means you have the respiratory diverticulum, you have primitive pharynx, and you have foregut proper. Now, the foregut. Let us define the foregut derivatives. As I mentioned earlier, you have the primordial pharynx, right? And you have the respiratory diverticulum rise here, divided the foregut into, again, primitive pharynx above, and the foregut proper. Now, this one, okay, the pharynx, there is no doubt about that. Now, what about the foregut proper? What will give? So, if you know the anatomy of the GI system in adults, you can conclude that, okay, we finished the pharynx. That means forget the diverticulum now. The foregut proper will give the esophagus, stomach, duodenum until the second part of the duodenum, and the second part is an opening, of course, for biliary system. That means you have the liver and gallbladder or biliary system, and posteriorly you have the pancreas. So these are the structures. Look at the esophagus. This is the dilatation of the stomach. This is the biliary system, and this is the liver, and posteriorly this is the pancreas. So these are the structures derived from foregut proper. Now let us start with the development of esophagus. Development of esophagus is straightforward, easy. You can see here's the esophagus that derived, of course, from the foregut, immediately caudal to the primitive pharynx, because you know that you have respiratory diverticulum divided the foregut into two parts. Cranial to it, which is the primitive pharynx, and caudal to it is the esophagus. So the esophagus developed from foregut just immediately caudal to the primitive pharynx. So this is the esophagus. Now, of course, because its location related to the respiratory diverticulum and trachea, that will form later trachea, bronchial, lung, and so forth. So there is a kind of a septum should be formed here between the trachea and esophagus. At the beginning, the trachea and esophagus, they are opening to each other, but this opening or this slit should be closed, and closed by a septum called, from its name, tracheoesophageal septum. This is the septum that should be closed in order to get this view, right? So should be closed by tracheoesophageal septum. Now the esophagus first like short, but with the further development and descent of the heart and lung, it's elongated more and more until it reached its final relative length by the 7th week. Now, after a week, because before that, if you take a look inside the esophagus at that time, you will see that it's obliterated, it's closed, the lumen is obliterated. Why? Because of the proliferation. Look, it's like full, right? Because of the proliferation of epithelial cells there. But this obliteration is temporarily. Why? Because say after a week there will be a kind of a process called recanalization, a process that or cavitation, a process that in which the epithelial cells start to degenerate and create a kind of a cavities. So these cavities with further days, it becomes like a canal, and this process will make the esophagus like a lumen, right? So hollow lumen, like empty from inside, right? So this process called the recanalization or cavitation of the esophagus. Now, the sometime if there is incomplete recanalization of the esophagus, this will lead to a kind of narrowing of the esophagus. For example, if the recanalization failed to happen at some point, so this create a kind of stenosis here. You see stenosis in the esophagus, known as esophageal stenosis. Now, of course, maybe you know that the epithelium and the glands inside the esophagus as a muscular tube lined with epithelium comes from the endoderm, of course, and striated muscle, especially in the upper part, comes from the fourth and sixth pharyngeal arches, while the smooth muscle in the lower, say, the inferior third, derived from splanchnic mesenchyme. Splanchnic mesenchyme. Moving to the from the esophagus to the second part, which is distal to it in the foregut, which is the stomach. Stomach is important, and in the fourth week, it started as a fusiform dilation. Appears in the caudal part of the foregut that indicates the site of future stomach. This dilatation, first of all, it's in the midline. So, for example, if this is the embryo, so it's in the midline, as you see, and the enlargement, the most interesting thing is you have to look to this figure now. The enlargement is anterior-posterior, or let us say ventrodorsally. That means the enlargement is not on both sides, not on the right and left, right? Not laterally, but the enlargement is anterior-posterior, right? Like somebody has a pulley and has um, uh, a large back, for example, right? So this is the idea of the stomach. If you look at it like laterally, you will see it's like anterior. The enlargement is anterior posterior, right, at this stage. Now, during the next 2 weeks, the dorsal border you see here grows much faster than the ventral. So the dorsal border, of course, you are looking to the stomach laterally, right? So the dorsal border grows faster, creating a greater curvature, while the ventral border will form the lesser one, the lesser curvature. Now, as stomach enlarges, and because of the unequal growth of different parts in the walls of stomach, and because of development of different organs in the embryo, this creates a kind of a factor to help the stomach to rotate, right? In which now the stomach will rotate 90 degrees clockwise. That means مع عقارب الساعة, right? Around its longitudinal axis. How's that? Let me show you here in this the stomach was like let me show you. The stomach was like that, anterior posterior, right? Anterior posterior. But now the rotation will be like that, 90 degrees. So until it approximates this position. So it was like this, then 90 degrees rotation clockwise, it becomes like this, right? So this is the position of the stomach in the adult, right? So this rotation, back to this rotation. So again, this is a cross section of the embryo. We mentioned that the stomach, which is like a tube that in the midline, as you see here. Now let us start the journey of rotation following these arrows, right? So it rotates 90 degrees clockwise around its longitudinal axis. So if this is, say, for example, this is the axis, so it moves around it. So as a result, what will happen? Now, before that, look at the stomach. So it has now, before rotation, it has the right surface and left surface. And you have dorsal border and ventral border. It's like a tube in the midline. With rotation now, the left surface now becomes anteriorly, right? The left surface now become, once rotated, just twist it like this, so now it becomes anteriorly. So the left surface now it becomes the ventral surface, while the right surface now it goes back, so it becomes the posterior or dorsal surface. So the right becomes dorsal, the left becomes ventral. What else? The ventral border moves to the right, because this is the right, this is the left. So the ventral border now moved, it becomes right. Look at it here. So it's the right, and the while the dorsal border now moves to the left. This is the rotation of the stomach. So what's the significance of this rotation? Yes, it's rotated. So then what? Yes, as I mentioned before the rotation, the two ends of the stomach, that means this the cardiac end and pyloric end, they were, I would like to adjust it a little bit, they were in the median plane, in the middle, right? While during the rotation, let us make, okay, let us say, right? So during the rotation, so the cranial end moves to the left, yes, and slightly inferiorly. That means once rotated, so the cranial end moves a little bit to the left, to this side. That means during the rotation, it moved a little bit like to the left and inferiorly. While the caudal end, this end, when it's rotated, it moved to the right and superiorly. This is what I meant by these statements. Now, after rotation, the stomach assumes its final position. Now, with its long axis, of the stomach is, almost perpendicular to the, maybe like this. It's a kind of perpendicular to the long axis of your body. Now, back again, what's the significance of that? Indeed, you maybe know that the vagus nerves innervate the stomach and other structure in the abdomen. So now let me again rotate the stomach back before rotation. Sorry. So let us draw now the right vagus nerve here and left vagus nerve here. So this is right vagus and this is left vagus. Now with rotation, now what will happen? That the right vagus becomes posterior. So the right vagus, this one, should go back to the back, and the left vagus now is the anterior one. You know what I mean? So the rotation changed even not just the location of the nerves, but also the orientation and where they are located and the names of them. So this explains why the left vagus, this one, the left vagus, that was of course the left, now it's anteriorly, right? And covers the, or innervates the anterior wall of the stomach, while the right vagus that was on the right side. Now, as you see here, with the rotation of the stomach, now becomes the posterior vagal trunk and innervates the posterior wall of the stomach. So, you know that the stomach, and from the beginning, it's connected to the posterior abdominal wall by mesogastrium. Mesogastrium. So, during the development of the stomach and during the rotation as well, there is a kind of a clefts created in this mesogastrium, right? So these clefts create a kind of a cavity here. This cavity called Omental Bursa or lesser sac, which is behind the stomach, right? So with the rotation of the stomach, the this bursa, Omental Bursa, expands transversally and cranially, right? Superior and inferior and to lateral side, which is between the stomach and the posterior abdominal wall. Look at the rotation of the stomach. When the stomach rotated, as you know, so it pulls the mesogastrium with it, and this creates, or it helps in enlarge the omental bursa or the lesser sac, as you see here. So it becomes larger and larger. With the also further development of the stomach, the omental bursa not just widen laterally, but also perennially, in which you see like it, deep in there, between layers of a greater, something called a greater omentum, 4 layers. So let us look to the adult, which is, I like to use it before explain how it's created in the embryology. This is the liver, this is the diaphragm, and this is the stomach. So the space that we are talking about is located behind the stomach, and this is the posterior abdominal wall. So this space in green color is the lesser sac, or omental bursa. So this is the lesser sac behind the stomach and between the stomach and posteriorly the posterior abdominal wall. So it extends superiorly until it's stopped by the diaphragm, and inferiorly it extends into between the 4 layers of a greater omentum that form the inferior recess of it. So it has a superior recess and inferior recess. You know, later the omental bursa, the greater omentum will unite and obliterate, so the space will be obliterated. Anyway, so back again here, this is the stomach and this is the posterior abdominal wall. So the space behind the stomach and anterior to posterior abdominal wall, this space is the lesser sac, extends superiorly and stopped by the diaphragm, and inferiorly it extends into greater omentum. At this stage it's still unfused layers, right? But then it will be fused and obliterated. But anyway, the lesser sac will still exist behind the stomach there. Now, let us continue the journey from the esophagus and then the stomach, and now the continuation is the duodenum, which is formed during the 4th week, but it formed, you know, that the duodenum composed from 4 parts. It's like S shape, right? Like C shape, right? It's like C shape, in which the proximal 2 parts originates from the foregut, while the distal 2 parts originate from midgut. That means the duodenum is the border, or it formed from foregut and midgut. So the junction between the two parts directly distal to the origin of liver bud. Say this is the liver bud, so the junction of two parts of duodenum just distal to the origin of liver buds. This is the liver bud or the hepatic diverticulum, right? And this is the distal end of foregut, and this is the beginning of the midgut that gives the second half of the duodenum, small intestine, including, I mean, jejunum, ileum, all the way until the right 2/3 of transverse colon. Anyway, the duodenum comes from foregut and midgut. This is very important. Why it's important? Because you know that the foregut, the blood supply foregut from celiac trunk, while the blood supply for midgut is from the superior mesenteric artery. That means the duodenum that formed from foregut and midgut, that means you have to expect that the blood supply comes from the celiac trunk and from the superior mesenteric artery, as you see here. Now, because as I mentioned, let me show you here. So let me erase this. Sorry. So anyway, I want to explain this. So look at the stomach and duodenum. It was like that in the midline, while the stomach rotated 90-degree clockwise. Also, it rotates the duodenum with it, right? This is the idea that I'm trying to explain it. But here, my friends, when you look to the duodenum, here is like parallel view of duodenum, in which it's like convexed anteriorly. Here is like parallel view. This is the stomach, you know, and this is the duodenal loop, in which it's convexed anteriorly, which is like C-shaped loop. Now the duodenal loop is rotated with the stomach to the right. You see the direction with clockwise, and it comes now to lie on the posterior abdominal wall behind the peritoneum. That's why mainly it's a retroperitoneal structure, except mainly the part from the first part of the duodenum, but mainly, let's say now, it becomes now retroperitoneally behind the peritoneum, of course, with the pancreas, because also the pancreas rotated with the stomach. So the stomach rotated, and it rotates with it the duodenal loop and the pancreas. So again, similar to the story of esophagus, during the 5th and 6th week, the lumen of the duodenum like temporarily closed, obliterated, because of the proliferation of the epithelial cells. But this is again temporarily, because in the process of recanalization, there is a degeneration of the epithelial cells in the lumen, make like a cavity inside the duodenum, and make it like again a hollow structure. So of course, by the end of the embryonic period, which is close to the period of recanalization of the esophagus, but here we are talking about the duodenum. Now again, similar to the esophagus sometime, but this is really common, there is congenital anomalies because of the either complete failure of recanalization, or sometime incomplete recanalization. So if there is incomplete recanalization, it will be like a stenosis, right, in the duodenum, which is similar to the esophageal stenosis. This is incomplete. There is a recanalization, but it's incomplete. But if there is complete failure to recanalization, that means you will get duodenal atresia. Duodenal atresia, that means complete obstruction, which is autosomal recessive inheritance, right? As a continuation of the duodenum now and Foregut, of course, we cannot ignore the development of the liver. Look at the liver bud here, liver diverticulum or hepatic diverticulum. So you can say liver bud or hepatic diverticulum. So the hepatic diverticulum, as here, appears at the 4th week, which is close to the time of appearance of the duodenum, right? And it arises from where? From the distal end of foregut. That means not from midgut, no, from the distal end or caudal part of the foregut. And it grows, do you remember from the previous lecture, the septum transversum, which is a mesoderm, right? This septum transversum will form the central tendon of the diaphragm. Look, above it is the lungs and the primordial heart and primordial lungs, right? So anyway, the liver bud or the hepatic diverticulum grows into septum transversum, and because of that, it divides it into two parts, cranial part and caudal part. Now, the cranial part of the primordium is the which is the largest one, and the smaller caudal one. The cranial part is the primordium of the liver. This will form the liver, right? And the smaller caudal part will give rise to gallbladder and cystic duct. Now, in the liver bud, the endoderm cells of hepatic bud proliferate and give rise to a hepatic cord, right? The hepatic cord, you know, if you take the histology, you will understand what I'm saying. So I don't like to focus too much now on that, but it's good to know that the hepatic cords in the liver formed from the endoderm, and plus the endoderm gives the epithelial lining the intrahepatic portion of biliary system. You know, there is secretion of the bile from the liver through ducts here that line by or form, sorry, by the epithelium in there formed by endoderm. So the epithelial lining of intrahepatic portion of biliary system formed by endoderm plus to the hepatic cord itself. And you know that the hepatic cords and stomos, of course, around the hepatic sinuses or sinusoids. Of course, this is a histology. I don't like to focus too much on that. Now, while with further development, the liver grows rapidly in the 5th and 10th, in the period between the 5th and 10th weeks, and it fills like large part from the abdominal cavity. However, in the 9th or by the 9th week, the liver forms around 10% of total body weight. That means it's enlarged really. And initially, you know that the liver has right lobe and left lobe, but initially the right lobe and left lobe are of the same size. But later, the right lobe becomes like grows largely. So as I mentioned, the liver cords differentiate into the liver cell, and the liver cords again originates from and of course the epithelial lining of the intrahepatic portion of biliary system are derived from endoderm, while the fibrous tissue or the hematopoietic tissue Kupffer cells, or they derive from mesenchyme of the septum transversum, because we mentioned that the hepatic bud or the hepatic diverticulum penetrates the septum transversum, and it divides it into two parts, but also it takes a kind of mesenchymal cell from there, right? While the hepatic sinusoids derived from vital line veins. Now, the formation and development of various types of blood cells, the formation of various type of blood cell, a process called hematopoiesis. Hematopoiesis, my friends, begins during the 6th week, very early in the liver, and it gives it the dark color. Now, on the other hand, the bile start to form in the hepatic cell at the 12th week. Now, to the caudal part, the small caudal, we mentioned that the septum transversum divided the hepatic diverticulum into two parts: cranial part, which that gives the liver, and the small caudal part that forms the gallbladder and cystic ducts. Now, the caudal part, as I mentioned, this is the gallbladder and this is the cystic duct, and here the stalk that connecting the hepatic duct and cystic duct, this stalk form or becomes the bile duct that will open into duodenum. But in which part of the duodenum? Yes, in the second part, ventrally. Why ventrally? Because initially, you know that the duodenum like still not rotated, but so it's open anteriorly. Once it's rotated, it becomes like twisted posteriorly, like the when the stomach rotated, and it rotates with it the duodenum, and of course the pancreas, and of course the hepatic or the bile duct, or they become posteriorly. And the duodenum itself, it becomes retroperitoneal posteriorly. Yes, as I mentioned, the opening now comes dorsally, as you see here. This is the gallbladder, this is the bile duct posterior to the duodenum now, and it's open the second part with duodenum. Now, similarly, the bile duct, similar to esophagus, similar to duodenum, it's obliterated, but temporarily, then it will open and recanalized later. So, we said that in the liver, the bile start to form at the 12th week, and here after, let us say, after a week, the bile now entering the duodenum, and because it's a green color, it gives the meconium. The meconium is the first intestinal charge of neonate once it's born, once he or she born. So the first stool called meconium, and it's a dark green color because of the bile there. One of the most interesting structures also developed from the foregut is the pancreas. So the pancreas, yes, develops from the caudal part of the foregut, and it develops or appears as two buds indeed. One is ventral, small one, and one is large, which is the dorsal pancreatic buds. The bud. That means you have ventral and dorsal pancreatic buds, and the dorsal bud is large, appears also first, and a little bit is higher cranial to the smaller ventral bud. Now, I would like you to know from the beginning that the dorsal pancreatic bud forms most of the pancreas. So this one, the dorsal one, will form the most of the pancreas. So you know that the stomach again and again rotated, and the duodenum as well, and so the rotation of the stomach and duodenum carries the ventral bud. You remember, this is the ventral bud, so the ventral bud will be carried posteriorly and dorsally, along with the, of course, bile duct, and then the ventral bud becomes now posterior. As you see here, the ventral bud becomes posterior to the dorsal bud because it was here ventrally, then it's rotated until it becomes like posterior to the dorsal bud, right? So the ventral pancreatic bud, this one, the smaller one, it forms or participates in the formation of the uncinate process and the part from the head of pancreas. So look at it here. Now it becomes like posterior to it, and then it fuses with it, and by this way it forms part from the uncinate process and head of pancreas. So again, the dorsal pancreatic bud forms most of the pancreas. The ventral one moved and because of the rotation of the stomach and duodenum to the back of the dorsal bud and unites with it, and it participates in the formation of the uncinate and head process of the pancreas. Now, move to the ducts now. What would be the result of this fusion? Now, you have to know that the duct, I will use this color, the duct of the ventral bud, you see here, and the distal part of the duct of dorsal bud. Look at the, this is the dorsal bud, right? And this is the duct of the dorsal bud, and it divided into, I would say, cranial part and distal part. So with the distal part of the duct of the dorsal bud, so they unite to form the main pancreatic duct. So the main pancreatic duct formed from the duct of the ventral bud and the dorsal bud, the distal part of the dorsal bud. Now, what about the proximal part? You know, proximal because it's closed up. So this is the proximal and this is the distal. So the proximal part of the dorsal bud, this one, will form the accessory pancreatic duct. Accessory pancreatic duct that, of course, opens into the minor duodenal papilla. Again, the main pancreatic duct here opens into major duodenal papilla, right? So you have two papillae. One is the major duodenal papillae, and you have minor duodenal papillae. The minor is above it, and it's formed by the accessory pancreatic duct that formed by the duct of the, or the proximal part of the duct of dorsal bud. This is very important. Now, finally, you know, just would like to remind you, look at here the pancreas and the rotation of the stomach and duodenum. Look at the ultimate position, the posterior abdominal wall, because of the rotation, and now it's in the posterior abdominal wall behind the peritoneum. Look at this layer. This is the peritoneum, the layer that lines the abdominal cavity. So look at the peritoneum. So look also at the pancreas. It's located behind it, behind the peritoneum. So it's retroperitoneal structure, of course, with the duodenum. This is a duodenum, this is the pancreas, both behind or posterior to the peritoneum. That's why it's called retroperitoneal structures. Now, it's good to know, especially to understand from where cancer cells originate in the pancreas. You have to know that the parenchyma, and you can say parenchyma, the parenchyma of pancreas derived from endoderm of pancreatic buds, right? And it forms also the tubules, because, you know, there are tubules inside it. Now, These are the parenchyma and of the pancreas and tubules from the endoderm. Now, around these tubules form the acini, right? The acini in the pancreas during the fetal, early in the fetal period. Now, some of cells separated from tubule, and they make like a kind of islets, right? Separated from there, from tubules, right? We call them pancreatic islets. Now, what about the connective tissue there in the pancreas and the interlobular septa? The septa there, it's, yes, they originated from splanchnic mesoderm. Splanchnic mesoderm. Now, insulin started to be secreted by the 10th week. That means the parenchyma of pancreas, tubules there, and so forth, islets, so they derived from endoderm. Spleen is, I would say, a little bit direct forward, in which you remember that the stomach, of course, in the midline, and it's connected by ventral and dorsal mesogastrium. Now, in the mesogastrium, in the dorsal mesogastrium, the mesenchyme there, proliferate to and develop, the spleen. So the spleen develops inside the dorsal mesogastrium. Now, the stomach rotated, as you know, 90 degrees clockwise, and that's why it moved the duodenum, pancreas, and the spleen as well to this position. It was first lobulated, but then these lobules will disappear after birth, and it reserves its function in the hematopoietic. It reserves its function as a hematopoietic organ until late fetal life. Yes, this is about the development of the spleen. Summarize to you the derivatives of the mesenteries of the foregut. Starting from the esophagus, it's not shown here, but if you go to the previous lecture, you would see that the ventral mesoesophagus, the ventral mesoesophagus will disappear. That means it's not connected anteriorly by mesentery, but posteriorly the dorsal mesoesophagus will becomes like the crura of the diaphragm, right? This is esophagus. Now come to the stomach. Look at, here is the stomach, that in which it's connected by ventral and dorsal mesogastrium, but let us start with the dorsal mesogastrium, in which it's connected to the spleen by gastro, because it's a stomach, right? This mesentery or ligament. What's the ligament? Ligament here is a double layer of peritoneum. Double layer of peritoneum thickened to form ligament. So this double layer of peritoneum, or the ligament between the stomach and spleen, called gastrosplenic ligament. And now this from spleen, that's formed inside the mesogastrium, from the spleen to the kidney, here this ligament is the lieno-renal, or you can say spleno renal ligament. Look, this is the tail of pancreas. Forget that for now. When we'll talk about the peritoneum later in the gross anatomy, we'll understand why the tail of pancreas located here. So the tail of pancreas just located here, but this ligament is a spleno renal or lieno-renal ligament. This is the fate of dorsal mesogastrium. Now, what about the ventral mesogastrium? Ventral mesogastrium connects, first of all, the part that connects the stomach to the liver is the lesser omentum. We call it lesser omentum. Also, the mesentery here covers the, of course, the peritoneum covers the liver. So this is the visceral peritoneum of the liver, and also anteriorly the peritoneum again united to form ligaments called forciform ligament of the liver, connects the liver to anterior abdominal wall. So this is the ventral mesentery. But also the duodenum is not shown here, so I don't know if we can explain it like this. So this is the liver, this is the duodenum. Anyway, so dorsal mesentery of the duodenum would, it's completely, the duodenum is like retroperitoneal structure, except in the first part, which is that connects the duodenum to the to the liver. This is called hepatoduodenal ligament. So that means the mesentery thickened there to form ligament, connects the liver to duodenum, the first part of duodenum, not even the first part, just the first 1 inch of it, right? And but the ventral mesentery, of course, will of the duodenum will disappear. Now, at the end, to talk briefly about anomalies related to the development of the foregut. Indeed, look at the figures on the right figure with that that shows variations of esophageal atresia and or tracheoesophageal fistula. For example, look at the esophagus here. Like you have the upper part, you have atresia completely obstructed, right? But the lower end, of course, it's a continuous tube, right? But it divided, so the upper part obliterated, esophageal, forms esophageal atresia, and here there is a fistula formed with the trachea, esophageotracheal fistula. Sometime you get like stenosis, forget this fistula, sometimes esophageal stenosis, usually in the distal part because of incomplete recanalization, as I mentioned earlier in the previous slide when we talked about the esophagus. Now, also sometimes you have a short esophagus. Of course, it's elongated because of the development and descent of the heart and lungs. But if it's really short, you get short. This is a stomach, of course, and this is esophagus. So this will lead to something called hiatal or hiatus hernia, right? In which part of the stomach goes up into the thoracic cavity through the opening of the diaphragm. So here you have the lung and heart. So part of the stomach goes up from the abdomen to the thorax, above the and above the diaphragm. Sometime also not in the distal part of the stomach, you get hypertrophic, which is a congenital anomaly, hypertrophic pyloric stenosis, in which the pylorus proliferated like this and create a kind of a narrow canal in which more than needed, right? Yes, there is stenosis, but this is like hypertrophy, which is congenital, in which one sign of the new baby is like continuous vomiting. Sometime the stomach rotated like in a wrong way rather than being on 90 degrees clockwise. And also sometimes you have variation in the shape of the stomach itself. Now shift away from the esophagus, stomach, and duodenum. Let us shift to the liver and biliary system, in which the anomalies in the liver is rare, or anomalies are rare, sorry, and sometimes you get variations in the hepatic duct, like distended one, sometime in the bile duct, stenosis or obliterated because it should be recanalized, like esophagus, like duodenum, and sometime in the cystic duct, so which is significantly important because that means the bile that produced in the liver will be accumulated, leading to a pathological jaundice. Now you can get like something called extrahepatic biliary atresia. That means it's a common serious anomaly, surgical intervention needed directly because it leads to a death if it's not corrected. There is an even sometime loss. There is no bile ducts completely or partially, and yeah, so these neonates, as I mentioned, have loss of or absence of all or significant portion of the extrahepatic biliary system. That means you get jaundice in the baby and doesn't disappear. So surgical intervention needed. Also, pancreas and spleen. Sometimes you get accessory pancreatic tissue on the duodenum and the stomach. Sometimes you get annular pancreas. What's the story of annular pancreas? Indeed, you remember the ventral pancreatic bud and dorsal pancreatic bud. Now, the ventral pancreatic bud, you get it like pivot, like this, مشطورة يعني. So, these two parts of the pivot ventral, because we know with the rotation of the stomach, the ventral bud should be moved and become now posterior to the dorsal bud. But in the case of pivot ventral pancreatic bud, the two parts now, because it's pivot, right? One part moves like posterior to the duodenum, and one part ventral to it. Then they united to each other, and it creates a kind of a complete ring around the duodenum, leading to duodenal obstruction. Sometimes the obstruction is not completely the duodenum is not completely obstructed, but you will get a stenosis, like tight stenosis there, and sometimes it doesn't like discovered until late in adult, right? But it causes duodenal obstruction. Sometimes you get not just accessory pancreatic tissue, you get accessory splenic tissue as well, right? In the like close to the hilum of the spleen or close to it. So that was, my friends, about the development of the foregut, and thank you for listening, and I hope you find value in it. Thank you.